The strange part wasn't that the officer walked into the diner angry. It was that someone had already started recording before he even opened his mouth. The lunch rush at Harper's Diner had settled into that quiet late-morning rhythm people in small Alabama towns knew well. The steady hum of coffee machines, the soft scrape of forks against plates, sunlight stretching across the checkered floor in long yellow stripes that made everything feel slower than it really was. And at the far corner booth near the window, two men sat across from each other with untouched coffee cooling between them, calm in a way that didn't match the tension that had been building outside for nearly 10 minutes before anyone inside noticed the patrol car parked just a little too close to the front entrance. Engine still running, driver still inside. Most customers never even looked up when the door opened, but the waitress did. Lily Carter always noticed who walked in. She had worked that same floor for 6 years, long enough to recognize when someone entered like they belonged and when someone entered like they were searching for something. Officer Derek Collins didn't pause to look around the room. He didn't nod at the regulars. He didn't remove his sunglasses, even though the diner lights were bright enough that most people would have. He walked straight toward the back corner booth as if he had already decided exactly where he was going before he stepped through the door, and that alone made Lily's stomach tighten before a single word was spoken. The two men at the booth didn't look up right away. One of them stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon circling once, twice, then stopping with a soft tap against the ceramic as Collins stopped beside their table. For a moment, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath without knowing why. Then Collins spoke, his voice louder than it needed to be for a room that small. "You two need to finish up and head outside." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a request. It sounded like something already decided. A couple sitting near the counter exchanged a quick glance. Someone in the kitchen doorway leaned forward slightly. Lily took one step closer without realizing she had moved. The man with the spoon looked up first. His expression didn't change. No surprise. No argument. Just a steady look that lasted 1 second longer than most people would hold eye contact with a uniformed officer. Across from him, the second man folded his napkin carefully, like he was finishing something important rather than being interrupted in the middle of lunch. Neither of them reached for their wallets. Neither of them asked why. And that was when Lily noticed something else that didn't make sense. A teenage boy sitting 3 booths away already had his phone raised, camera pointed directly at the corner table, even though Collins hadn't said anything serious yet. It was as if he had known this moment was coming before anyone else in the room did. Collins shifted his stance, impatient now, tapping 2 fingers lightly against the edge of the table. "I said it's time to go." Still no movement. The first man glanced briefly toward the front window, just for a second, then back at Collins, calm in a way that didn't match the tension spreading through the room like invisible smoke. Lily followed his glance without meaning to. Across the street, parked between a delivery van and a faded pickup truck, sat a dark SUV she was almost certain hadn't been there 5 minutes earlier. Its engine was running too, and someone inside it was watching the diner. Then the man at the booth finally spoke, his voice quiet, but clear enough that half the room heard it anyway. "Officer," he said slowly, "are you sure you want to do this right here?" Collins didn't answer. He reached forward instead, placing his hand on the back of the chair like he was about to make the decision for them himself. And that was the exact moment Lily realized something was already unfolding in that diner long before the officer walked through the door. Officer Derek Collins did not remove his hand from the chair even after the man spoke. And that was the moment the entire room seemed to shift from confusion into something heavier, something quieter, like everyone could feel a line had just been crossed even if they could not explain why. Because most officers who entered Harper's Diner usually started with questions, not decisions. But Collins was already leaning forward as if the outcome had been settled long before he arrived, and the only thing left now was for the 2 men in the booth to accept it. Yet neither of them moved, and neither of them looked surprised, which was the first detail Lily Carter realized did not match the situation unfolding in front of her eyes. The man closest to the window rested both hands calmly on the edge of the table, as if he was waiting for something specific to happen next, not avoiding the officer, not challenging him either, just watching him with a level of patience that made Collins shift his weight slightly, without meaning to. And across from him, the second man adjusted his coffee cup a few inches to the right like he was making space on the table for something invisible that had not arrived yet. Collins cleared his throat once, louder this time, and repeated himself with sharper emphasis. I said it is time to step outside. A few customers lowered their forks. Someone near the counter stopped mid-sentence. Even the ceiling fan above the entrance suddenly seemed louder than before. Lily moved closer without realizing she had left the safety of the service counter behind her, because she had seen this pattern before in smaller moments over the years, seen how quickly ordinary mornings could turn into something people talked about for months afterward. But what she had never seen before was someone remain this calm when an officer was standing directly over them speaking like that. The man by the window finally glanced again toward the street outside, only for half a second. But this time Lily followed his eyes more carefully and noticed the dark SUV across the road had not moved at all, and the driver inside had not stepped out either. And something about that stillness made her chest tighten in a way she could not explain. Collins noticed the glance too. His jaw tightened slightly. "Do not make this complicated," he said, lowering his voice just enough that it sounded less like a warning and more like a decision already made. The second man folded his hands together slowly, then looked up with the same steady, calm expression he had carried since Collins arrived, and spoke in a voice so even that it forced Collins to pause for a fraction of a second longer than he expected. "Officer, who asked you to come in here today?" That question did something unexpected. Collins blinked once. Not confusion exactly. Something closer to hesitation. The customers noticed it too. Lily noticed it. Even the teenager recording from 3 booths away leaned forward slightly, like he understood the question mattered more than anything else that had been said so far. Collins recovered quickly, straightening his shoulders, but his answer came half a second too late to feel natural. "That is not your concern." The man by the window nodded slowly, almost like he had expected that answer before asking the question at all, then reached for his untouched coffee cup but did not drink from it. Just held it for a moment while watching the officer's face carefully, as if measuring something invisible in the air between them. Outside the diner, the engine of the SUV across the street suddenly grew louder for just a second before settling back into silence again. And inside the booth, the second man checked the time on his watch, not nervously but precisely, like someone confirming a schedule that had already been set long before anyone walked through that door. Then he looked up at Collins again and said quietly, "You arrived earlier than we expected." And that was the moment Collins realized he was no longer the only one who had planned what was happening inside that diner. Officer Derek Collins did not respond immediately after hearing those words, and that hesitation lasted only a second, but inside Harper's diner it stretched long enough that several customers shifted in their seats, as if something invisible had just changed direction in the air. Because officers were not supposed to be surprised inside their own jurisdiction, and they were definitely not supposed to look like they had arrived somewhere earlier than expected by people they had never met before. Yet Collins felt that exact realization settle quietly behind his eyes, even while he kept his voice steady. "Expected by who?" he asked, and this time the question came faster than before, sharper than before, almost like he needed the answer quickly enough to prove something to himself. The man near the window did not answer right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly in the booth, not retreating, not relaxing, simply adjusting his posture as if the timing of something important had just shifted by a few seconds. Across from him, the second man placed both hands flat on the table again and looked toward the front entrance for just a moment, before returning his attention to Collins with the same calm expression he had carried since the officer arrived. "You walked in through the front door at exactly 11:37, he said quietly, his voice steady enough that several customers closer to the aisle turned their heads without realizing they were listening now. Collins blinked again. Not confusion this time. Recognition. Because that was the exact time. And there was no reason for a stranger to know that unless they had been watching him before he entered the building. Lily Carter felt her fingers tighten slightly around the notepad she was still holding, even though she had not written anything down for the past 2 minutes. She had worked long enough in that diner to recognize when conversations stopped being ordinary conversations and started becoming something else entirely. Collins shifted his stance again and glanced briefly toward the windows facing the street without meaning to. The dark SUV was still there, still running, still waiting. He looked back at the 2 men in the booth and lowered his voice slightly. "You two have been here how long?" The man near the window answered immediately this time. "Long enough." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the teenager with the phone recording lean even closer into the aisle without realizing he had moved. Collins felt the rhythm of the moment slipping away from him, and that realization made his tone sharper again. "I am asking you to step outside now." But neither man stood up. Neither man reached for their jackets. Neither man looked at each other for permission. Instead, the second man slowly reached toward the small stack of sugar packets near the edge of the table and moved one of them slightly to the left like he was aligning something only he could see. Then he spoke again, quieter than before, but clear enough that Collins heard every word. "Officer Collins, before you ask us to leave this diner again, you should probably ask yourself why nobody else in this room looks surprised that you are here." Collins turned his head instinctively. The couple near the counter had stopped eating entirely. The cook in the kitchen doorway had not stepped back inside. The teenager was still recording. Even Lily had not returned to the register. It was not fear on their faces. It was anticipation. And that realization reached Collins at the same moment the radio clipped to his shoulder gave a short burst of static that had not been there a second earlier. He reached toward it automatically, but before he could press the button, the man near the window spoke one more time, his voice calm enough to stop Collins's hand halfway through the movement. "You should probably listen carefully before you answer that call," he said quietly. And that was the moment Collins realized the radio on his shoulder had not activated by accident. Officer Derek Collins felt the radio on his shoulder vibrate once more before it even made a sound, and that alone was enough to make something inside his chest tighten, because radios did not behave like that unless someone else was already trying to control the conversation before it started. Yet when the static finally cleared, the voice that came through was not urgent, and it was not loud, and that made it worse. "Unit 12, confirm your location," the dispatcher said calmly, too calmly for what Collins suddenly realized might not be a routine check at all. Collins pressed the button automatically, but before he spoke he noticed something else that had not been there a minute earlier. The dark SUV outside the diner had not just remained parked. Its driver's side door was now slightly open. No one had stepped out yet, but someone was ready to. Collins released the radio button without answering. He had heard dispatchers long enough to recognize when a request sounded normal and when it sounded like someone was waiting for confirmation they already expected to receive. Behind him, the soft hum of the diner had not returned. Nobody resumed eating. Nobody resumed talking. Even the ceiling fan still seemed louder than before. The man near the window watched Collins carefully, but did not smile and did not move, and that stillness carried more pressure than any raised voice could have. "Officer Collins," he said quietly, "dispatch usually knows exactly where you are already." The sentence landed slowly, not as a challenge, not as a warning, more like a reminder. Collins turned slightly toward the windows again, and this time he noticed a second vehicle farther down the street that had not been there earlier either, parked half a block away, but angled just enough that its windshield faced directly toward the diner entrance, like someone inside had been watching the front door for longer than anyone inside the building realized. Collins pressed the radio button again. "Unit 12 at Harper's Diner," he said firmly, forcing his voice to sound routine, even though the room around him no longer felt routine at all. The response came back faster than expected. "Too fast." "Copy that," dispatch replied, followed by a pause that lasted just long enough to make Collins's jaw tighten before the voice continued again, slower this time. "Remain where you are." Collins lowered the radio slowly but did not clip it back into place. "Remain where you are." That was not standard language for a routine location confirmation. That was language used when movement mattered, when timing mattered, when someone else was already making decisions about what happened next. Lily Carter felt her breath catch quietly as she watched Collins's shoulders shift slightly in a way she had never seen before. It was not fear. It was awareness. The kind that came when someone realized they were no longer the only person directing what was happening inside a room. The second man in the booth glanced once more toward the window and then back toward Collins with the same steady, calm expression he had carried from the beginning. "You should probably stay exactly where you are," he repeated softly. Collins did not answer him. Instead, he looked around the diner again, and this time the details stood out differently than before. The teenager recording had not lowered his phone once. The cook had not stepped back into the kitchen. Even the couple near the counter had not returned to their meals. They were not watching the two men at the booth anymore. They were watching him. And that was when Collins understood something that had not made sense when he first walked through the door. Nobody inside Harper's Diner looked surprised that he had arrived. They looked like they had been waiting for him to. Officer Derek Collins did not move even after the dispatcher's words settled into the silence around him, because remain where you are was not something officers heard unless someone else had already taken control of the timeline. And for the first time since he stepped inside Harper's Diner, he began to realize that whatever had brought him there was no longer happening on his terms. He slowly unclipped the radio from his shoulder, but did not speak into it again. Instead, he looked back at the two men seated in the booth, as if seeing them clearly for the first time rather than as two customers he thought he could move along without explanation. The man near the window had not touched his coffee once since Collins arrived. The other had not reached for his wallet or his phone, or even shifted in his seat, like someone preparing to leave. They were not waiting for instructions from him. They were waiting for something else entirely. You said dispatch already knew where I was, Collins said carefully, his voice lower now, slower than before, as if he was testing the shape of the moment rather than controlling it. The man near the window nodded once. Dispatch usually knows where everyone is, he replied quietly, then glanced toward the front entrance again with the same calm awareness he had shown from the beginning. Collins followed that glance automatically, and this time he noticed something new that had not been there even 30 seconds earlier. The door of the dark SUV across the street was open wider now, and a figure inside had shifted forward slightly, but had still not stepped out onto the sidewalk. Whoever was inside that vehicle was not in a hurry. Whoever was inside that vehicle was waiting for something precise. Collins felt a quiet pressure settle behind his ribs that did not come from fear, but from recognition. He had seen operations unfold before. He had seen coordinated timing before. And what he was seeing now did not match a routine morning call about two men sitting in a diner booth. Behind him, Lily Carter realized she was still holding the same notepad she had picked up minutes earlier, and that she had not written a single order on it since the officer walked through the door. She glanced toward the cook in the kitchen doorway and noticed he was not watching the customers anymore. He was watching Collins. Even the couple at the counter had turned fully in their seats now. Not curious, not confused, waiting. Collins looked back toward the booth again, and this time his voice carried a different tone than before. You two want to explain what is going on here. The second man folded his hands together again on the table, but did not answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the clock above the register for just a moment, and then back at Collins. We were hoping you would ask that question, he said quietly. Collins felt his grip tighten slightly around the radio still in his hand. Hoping. The man near the window nodded once more. Yes, he said calmly. Because the timing matters. Collins glanced toward the windows again, almost without thinking, and that was when he noticed the second vehicle down the block had shifted position slightly closer than before, even though he had not seen it move. It had simply appeared nearer, closer, watching. And at that exact moment, the radio in his hand gave another short burst of static followed by a voice that did not belong to the dispatcher this time. It was deeper, direct. Unit 12 remain inside the building, the voice said clearly. Additional personnel are arriving. Collins did not recognize the voice, and that was when he understood something he had not allowed himself to consider until that moment. This was no longer his call to manage, and someone else had already decided exactly how the next few minutes inside Harper's Diner were going to unfold. Officer Derek Collins did not recognize the voice on the radio, and that detail stayed with him longer than the words themselves because every officer learned very quickly to recognize the voices that controlled their day. Dispatchers, supervisors, captains, and coordinators. Yet this voice belonged to none of them and still spoke with the kind of certainty that left no room for misunderstanding, which meant someone else had already stepped into the chain of command without ever stepping into the diner. Collins slowly lowered the radio but did not clip it back to his shoulder because something inside him understood that the next sound it made might matter more than anything that had already happened in the last 10 minutes. The two men in the booth had not reacted to the message at all. That was the first thing he noticed. They did not exchange looks. They did not shift in their seats. They did not ask questions. It was as if they had expected those exact words to arrive at that exact moment. Collins studied them carefully now, not as strangers, not as customers, but as people who clearly knew more about the situation inside Harper's Diner than he did. Additional personnel, he repeated quietly, almost to himself. The man near the window nodded once. Yes, he said calmly. like someone confirming a schedule rather than reacting to new information. Collins felt the timing settle into place around him in a way that made everything that had happened since he walked through the front door feel less accidental and more arranged. He glanced toward the entrance again, and this time he heard something before he saw it. Tires rolling slowly across asphalt outside. Not fast, not urgent, controlled, deliberate. The dark SUV across the street finally moved. It did not speed forward. It did not turn away. It crossed the road slowly and stopped directly in front of the diner windows where everyone inside could see it clearly now. No sirens. No flashing lights. Just presence. Lily Carter felt her breath catch again as the vehicle came to a complete stop because whatever had been building inside the diner since Collins arrived was no longer invisible. Now it had weight. Now it had direction. Collins kept his eyes on the SUV, but did not step toward the door. He remembered the instruction clearly. Remain inside the building. Remain where you are. The engine outside shut off. One door opened. Then another. Still no one entered. The two men in the booth remained seated. One of them glanced briefly toward the clock again, and then back toward Collins with the same steady, calm expression he had carried from the beginning of the encounter. Right on time, he said quietly. Collins looked back at him sharply. Right on time for what? The second man finally reached toward the inside pocket of his jacket, but stopped before removing anything and rested his hand there instead, as if waiting for permission that did not need to be spoken out loud. For confirmation, he answered. Collins felt something shift behind his ribs again, because confirmation meant there had been uncertainty before this moment, and uncertainty meant observation, and observation meant someone had been watching long before he arrived. The front door of the diner opened slowly, and the sound of the bell above it echoed louder than it should have in a room that quiet, but the person who stepped inside was not in uniform, and did not look like a customer either. He paused just inside the entrance, scanning the room once, then nodded slightly toward the two men in the booth before turning his attention directly toward Collins, as if he had already known exactly where Collins would be standing when he walked through that door. Officer Derek Collins did not speak when the man stepped inside the diner because the way he entered made it immediately clear he was not there to order food, and he was not there by accident either. He walked with the calm confidence of someone who already understood what had happened during the last 15 minutes inside Harper's diner, and that realization settled across the room before he even reached the center aisle. The bell above the door stopped ringing, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything Collins had experienced since the moment he first approached the booth near the window. The man paused halfway between the entrance and the counter and looked once toward the cook standing frozen in the kitchen doorway, once toward the teenager still recording with his phone raised carefully at chest level, and then finally toward the two men seated in the corner booth. Neither of them stood up. Neither of them greeted him. They simply nodded once, as if confirming something that had already been decided earlier that morning somewhere else entirely. Collins watched the exchange carefully and realized that the nod was not casual recognition. It was acknowledgement. The man near the window finally reached inside his jacket, and this time he did remove something from the inner pocket. Not quickly and not dramatically, but slowly enough that everyone inside the diner could see the movement clearly without misunderstanding it. He placed the small leather wallet on the table and opened it halfway, but did not turn it toward Collins yet. Instead, he looked directly at the man who had just entered the diner and spoke in the same calm, steady voice he had used since the beginning. "We are ready." The words changed something in the air immediately. The man near the entrance gave a short nod in return and stepped closer, stopping exactly 2 booths away from Collins, as if respecting an invisible boundary that had been there all along, even though no one else could see it. Collins felt his shoulders tighten slightly because he understood that whatever identification had just been placed on the table was not meant for him first. It was meant for the man who had just walked in. The second man in the booth now reached inside his own jacket as well and removed another badge case, placing it beside the first one without opening it yet. "Confirmation received," he said quietly. Collins felt the words land with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Confirmation meant there had been a process. Confirmation meant there had been observation. Confirmation meant that something about this moment had been waiting to happen before he ever parked his patrol car outside the diner. The man who had entered the diner finally stepped closer to the table and glanced briefly at the two badge cases resting there before lifting his eyes toward Collins with a calm expression that carried no hostility and no uncertainty, only certainty. "Officer Collins," he said evenly, speaking his name in a tone that made it clear he had known exactly who he was before walking through the door. Collins felt the room shift again at the sound of his name spoken that way because he had never introduced himself to anyone inside the diner. The man near the window finally turned the open badge wallet toward Collins, and for the first time since the encounter began, the reason behind their calm presence inside Harper's diner became visible in a way that no longer allowed assumptions to survive. "Detective Marcus Reed," he said quietly. Then the second badge case opened beside it. "Detective Ethan Brooks." Collins did not reach for the badges. He did not need to. The weight of what those names meant had already reached him before he even saw the identification clearly. And that was the moment he understood that the two men he had asked to leave the diner earlier that morning had never been waiting for permission to go anywhere at all. Officer Derek Collins did not speak after seeing the badges because something deeper than surprise settled into the silence around him. Something heavier than confusion and quieter than fear. The kind of realization that arrives when a moment you thought you controlled suddenly reveals it has been controlled by someone else the entire time. And for the first time since he stepped inside Harper's diner, he understood that every second he had spent standing beside that booth had already been recorded in ways he could not see. Detective Marcus Reed closed the badge slowly but did not return it to his jacket yet, leaving it resting on the table like a marker placed exactly where it needed to be, while Detective Ethan Brooks kept his badge open a moment longer, as if allowing Collins the time he needed to understand what the presence of both identifications inside that diner truly meant. The man who had entered from the street stepped closer now and stopped beside the booth with a calm confidence that made it clear he was not arriving late to the situation, but arriving exactly when he was supposed to. "Everything confirmed," he said quietly, his voice steady and measured in a way that carried authority without needing to raise itself above the silence in the room. Collins looked from one face to the other, and then toward the front windows again, where the dark SUV remained parked directly outside, as if the entire street itself had been rearranged around this one moment. "Confirmed what?" Collins asked finally, and this time his voice no longer sounded like an instruction. It sounded like a question that had already begun answering itself. Detective Brooks reached into the inside pocket of his jacket again and removed a thin folded document envelope, placing it carefully beside the coffee cup that had remained untouched since the beginning of the encounter. He did not open it. He did not slide it across the table. He simply rested his hand beside it, as if the envelope itself had been waiting longer than anyone inside the diner realized. "Presence," Brooks said quietly. Collins frowned slightly. "Presence." Detective Reed nodded once. "Yes," he said calmly. Confirmation of presence inside a controlled environment. The words carried a meaning that reached Collins before he even finished hearing them, because controlled environment was not language used during ordinary interactions, and confirmation of presence was not something officers usually heard directed at themselves unless they were part of something larger than they had been told. Lily Carter felt her breath slow as she watched the exchange unfold because the tone inside the diner had shifted completely now, no longer tense in the uncertain way it had been earlier, but precise in a way that felt planned long before anyone walked through the door that morning. Collins glanced once more toward the entrance and noticed another plain vehicle had stopped farther down the street without drawing attention from anyone outside the diner, and that detail settled into his thoughts alongside everything else he had begun noticing too late. "You have been observing me," he said quietly. Detective Reed did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the man standing beside the booth, who gave a small confirming nod before Reed spoke again. "We have been documenting patterns," he said calmly. Collins felt the words land with more weight than any accusation because patterns meant time and documentation meant preparation, and preparation meant this encounter had never been random. "This location," Brooks added quietly, resting his hand beside the sealed envelope again, "was selected for visibility." Collins looked around the diner once more, and this time he understood what that meant. The customers had not simply been witnesses. The positioning of the vehicles outside had not been coincidence. Even the timing of the radio messages had not been routine. Everything had been arranged so that what happened inside Harper's diner could not be misunderstood later by anyone who needed to see it clearly. Collins lowered the radio slowly into his hand again, but did not raise it to his shoulder. "So this was a setup," he said carefully. Detective Reed shook his head once. "No," he replied calmly. "This was confirmation." And that was the moment Collins realized that whatever decision had brought him through the diner door earlier that morning had already become the final detail someone else had been waiting for. Officer Derek Collins did not answer immediately after hearing the word confirmation because something inside him had already begun connecting the last 20 minutes into a single clear line he could no longer ignore. And for the first time since he walked through the doors of Harper's diner, he understood that this moment had never been about asking two men to leave a booth. It had been about what he chose to do after he believed he had the authority to do it. Detective Marcus Reed slowly closed the badge wallet and placed it back inside his jacket with the same calm precision he had shown since the beginning, while Detective Ethan Brooks finally lifted the sealed envelope from the table and held it carefully between his fingers as if the paper inside carried more weight than anyone in the room could see from the outside. The man who had entered from the street stepped one pace closer to Collins and spoke again with the same steady tone he had used from the moment he arrived. "Officer Collins, this interaction has been fully documented," he said quietly, not as an accusation but as a statement that required no response. Collins glanced once more around the diner, and this time he noticed details he had not allowed himself to notice earlier. The teenager still holding the phone steady, without lowering it once. The cook standing exactly where he had remained since the moment the patrol car arrived outside. The couple near the counter watching not with curiosity, but with understanding. And even Lily Carter standing near the register with her notepad still untouched, because she had sensed long before anyone else that something larger than an ordinary morning shift had been unfolding inside the room. Detective Brooks opened the envelope slowly and removed a single folded document, not rushing the movement, not presenting it dramatically, simply unfolding it with the quiet confidence of someone who knew it had already been expected. "Administrative review authorization," he said calmly as he held the document at a slight angle where Collins could read the heading without needing to step closer. Collins felt the words settle into place with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, because administrative review authorization was not issued without preparation and it was not delivered without timing. "Effective immediately," Brooks continued, his voice steady and even. "Your field activity for the remainder of today is reassigned pending evaluation." Collins lowered his radio slowly into his hand again, but did not raise it to respond because he understood now that the instruction he had heard earlier to remain inside the building had not been a suggestion and it had not been routine communication. It had been part of a process already moving forward whether he spoke or not. Detective Reed watched him carefully but without hostility, only with the quiet certainty of someone who had completed the final step of something that had taken longer than anyone inside the diner realized. "This location was selected because visibility matters," Reed said softly, glancing once toward the windows where the dark SUV remained parked exactly where it had stopped earlier, still silent, still waiting, still part of the moment that had brought everything together. Collins looked once more around the diner, and this time the stillness felt different, no longer uncertain, no longer tense, but finished in a way that left no confusion about what had just happened inside that small corner booth. The man who had entered from the street nodded once toward the detectives and then back toward Collins before speaking one final time. "You were not asked to come here by accident," he said calmly. Collins understood then that every decision he had made since stepping through the diner door had already become part of something larger than a single conversation, larger than a single morning, larger than a single uniform standing beside a table. And as the quiet inside Harper's diner finally began to shift back toward ordinary sounds again, Collins realized the two men he believed he had the authority to remove from that booth had never been waiting to leave at all because they had been waiting for him to arrive.